Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. As nonprofit leadership is increasingly under the microscope when it comes to public trust, transparency, and accountability, particularly in light of recent high-profile revelations about organizations such as Hockey Canada and We Charity. And as the sector grapples with a lack of diversity at the leadership level, we ask, is it time for a leadership refresh? Joining me to discuss these important issues is Mark Blumberg. Mark is a partner at the law firm Blumbergs Professional Corporation in Toronto and works almost exclusively advising nonprofits and registered charities on their work in Canada and abroad. Welcome, Mark, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Mary. I look forward to discussing these issues with you.
Now let's start by doing an overall check-in on how the sector is dealing with issues related to governance and leadership. In light of some of the high-profile issues we've seen come up recently, including Hockey Canada and We Charity, can you talk about why the sector sees problems like this arise? How does it get to this point?
Well, yeah, there's been a number of high-profile problems that we've seen with charities, nonprofits, registered Canadian amateur athletic groups, and things like that. And what I would say is fundamentally, probably the biggest issue is a lack of transparency and accountability from many of these organizations. And, there are other issues that have come up, including the importance of filing accurate returns. So, for example, in some of the scandals, groups were filing T3010s that were maybe not accurate, or they were not filing financial statements with Corporations Canada, which you're supposed to do if you're a federal corporation. So it doesn't look good if you're a major organization taking in $50 or $100 million a year, and you're not doing the mandatory filings you're supposed to do, which take about 5 minutes once you've got your financial statements. So that's the sort of thing that I think definitely created some significant challenges. But there were other issues as well. You do a lot of work in the HR area, and you know that sometimes charities, how they deal with HR is not so wonderful. And charities are spending like over 160 billion on HR every year. And if they don't have good practices in that area, then unfortunately it can result in problems and things like that. Another angle is that with many of these scandals, the board oversight was not great. And a lot of it comes down to your point about diversity and the lack thereof. If you have 10 people on a board and they're all super interested in hockey and they all have been involved in the hockey movement for the last 25 years, probably it's not the most diverse group that you're getting there. And maybe you should be asking questions about whether you should have more diversity. If you have a large foundation, and it's, you think, well, it's a family foundation. So, it's just a family. So it's probably not going to be diverse. But you can then have maybe a committee that helps with some of the grant making, that is what they call participatory, so you bring in other people that are diverse, and they don't have to be on your board. They don't have to be members, but they can help you in making decisions so you make better decisions in the end. The charity sector affects just about almost all Canadians. Probably 15 million Canadians between volunteering and donating and things are involved, maybe more than that. It has a huge number of people involved, and yet sometimes the organizations are not reflective at all of either the beneficiaries, the donors, etc. Some of the other things that have come up were related transactions and conflicts of interest. There's nothing like that to immediately turn your donors and the public, into worrying about the appropriateness of other things if you have these conflicts of interest, or if you have corporations that are tightly associated with your entity, but for example, they're for profit and you're not clearly maintaining sort of a separation between the charity and the for-profit and things like that. Those are some of the things that have come up over the last few years, and it's unfortunately created a big problem. And then there's even worse stuff. There's a lot of discussion about residential schools that happen, and this is not like ancient history, because some of these residential schools were operating, I think, even just a couple decades ago. So residential schools were largely run by charities, and there was a lot of abuse, and this sort of stuff, grappling with this has made people really wonder about, because some of these are the same charities that were involved with running residential schools, the same charities that were involved with, sexual harassment allegations and things like that. So the question of, do they have the processes, procedures, and everything else to make sure that they aren't doing the same things that they were doing 10, 20, 30 years ago? These are some of the questions I think that some people have in their minds.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we know that most nonprofits and charities in the country are probably doing terrific work and shouldn't be tarnished by these high-profile cases. But is it still possible for the average organization, many of them small, to learn something from these scandals and of malfeasance or a lack of transparency or bad governance? What are some of the lessons that smaller charities or any charity or nonprofit could learn from these more high profile cases?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I'd start with is not to learn the wrong lessons, right? Someone might say, oh, this charity had a relationship with a for-profit entity, so we shouldn't do that. There's nothing wrong with a charity having a relationship with a for-profit entity. It's just that there's rules and expectations and transparency that's needed. So it's important not to learn the wrong lessons, which I see sometimes people thinking about when they look at these things. The other thing is to realize that every charity is different. Their objects are different, their resources are different, their skill sets are different, etc. So there is no one size fits all. But in general, governance and not about changing your bylaw every year to tweak it, but real governance, as in real discussions about real issues, real transparency, putting out real information that is helpful for your stakeholders to understand the work that you're doing, the challenges you're facing, whether you're having success or not in a particular area. These are the sort of things that groups should be thinking about. A lot of the mistakes that were made are not complicated mistakes. They're actually quite simple. We have a little checklist on our website of about the top 25 CRA issues, for example, or other sort of governance things that charities should be looking out for. And so these are things like, if you follow the basic rules, you shouldn't have a problem. One of the challenges with the charity sector is people do have this sort of idea that it's like an angelic group of people. And reality is with, over 2 million employees and with many millions of volunteers and many different organizations doing many different things. CRA says 252 different categories of charities. So very big, shall we say, diversity in the types of work that charities are doing. It's hard to just draw simple lessons. You need to really think. So a $2 billion hospital and a $50,000 charity, there are major differences between them. And it's important to realize that and not try to just sort of cut and paste copy what another entity is doing, but to sometimes think about what would be the appropriate way for your particular entity to deal with things. So I think, yeah, you can learn, don't learn the wrong lessons, but really do think about it. They say that you can build a reputation, spend decades, and then in a few minutes you can destroy it, right? So many charities, or some charities, have unfortunately lost their reputations because of these problems. The other thing is, I think that the charity sector does need to grapple with, as one charity puts it, they have a program, it's called Do No Harm. It's to ask about, what are you doing? Is everything you're doing angelic and wonderful and helping people, and your charity doesn't cause any harm? Well, I haven't yet seen a charity that's like that, where it's like perfect and everything is great. Every charity to some extent is causing some harm, whether it's the greenhouse gases when they send people to conferences or whatever. But the point is to try and understand what harm you're causing, to understand how you can mitigate or minimize such harm, and things like that, and to have processes and procedures. So in other words, we mustn't go with the view that, oh, charities are wonderful and they do wonderful things, and therefore we shouldn't criticize them, we shouldn't analyze them too hard because they're so wonderful. It's not a healthy environment to be in if you think that way. It's a little bit more like a cult type approach. Instead, it would be better to say, these are normal people who run charities. Some of them are maybe excellent people, some of them not so excellent. And there needs to be accountability, transparency, because there's so many people that they affect, and especially vulnerable people. And so in the end, I think most people would say that we're trying to have the maximum benefit that one can have. So one has to ask hard questions around whether all charities are meeting the basic standards that one would expect of a charity. Okay.
Well, on that point about it may take years to build a positive reputation and only a few days for you to rip it down by making a terrible mistake or doing something that one shouldn't. in terms of public trust, there have been multiple reports, including from Environics and in the CanTrust Index by Proof Strategies, that have indicated there's been a sharp decline in public trust of charities over the past decade. Do you think this is in part related to the scandals such as Hockey Canada or We Charity? What other factors do you see as influencing this drop in public trust?
Yeah, look, I wish it was because of a few high-profile scandals, because then if we could just avoid a few high-profile scandals, we could solve this problem. But no, it's not. In fact, the decline largely was even before some of these scandals. And, some people say, well, but, trust in all institutions, government, business has gone down, etc. But apparently it's gone down more in the charity sector, and it's been a bigger problem. And I think it's a bigger problem because charities don't have the coercive power of government. They don't have the ability to necessarily sell a product. When I think of like the iPhone, you might not like the way that Apple treats its workers in China or something like that, but if you want the iPhone, you're probably going to get it. Whereas when it comes to donations, if you were very worried about a charity, how it treats its employees or treats its beneficiaries, you just won't give to the charity. It's a very different world. So I think this is a bigger problem for charities than it is for other groups, perhaps. And there's a lot of reasons for this huge sort of deficit right now in public trust. Largely, I would say it's related to the lack of perception that there's a lack of accountability and transparency when it comes to charities in Canada. Charities still, file the T3010 form every year. Some of them don't do such a good job of doing it, and it asks for very little information. If you look at the US forms, the 990, you'll see, Mary, huge amounts of information being asked of American charities. I'm not saying we should go that far, but what we have is less today than what we had 15 years ago. And when you think of all of the information that's available to people with their fingertips, the lack of transparency and accountability with charities, I think, creates a problem. And it can be dealt with. CRA has tools to deal with some of it. Some of it requires changes to the Income Tax Act to allow, for example, for right now, nonprofits in some cases have no transparency. You could have a $500 million nonprofit and no one even knows about it. This is not a healthy way to run organizations if you're trying to, make sure that they're operating in an appropriate way. So I think that if they can improve the accountability of organizations, the transparency, especially, then I think that a lot can be done to also have Canadian population understand the impact that charities are having. Some groups, for example, on their T3010, they just put down what their objects are. They don't even talk about their impact. They don't talk about their activities. They don't say what they're really doing. So I think it'll be a win-win sort of situation. I think one of the things that has not been helpful around 2019, the Liberal government changed the rules so that charities can do essentially unlimited nonpartisan political activities, and we'll call them public policy, dialogue, and development activities. And I think a lot of people have a concern with that. I think people can understand why charities should be involved in some political matters, but spending all of your money on it, unfortunately, is maybe more than what I think many people are thinking a charity should be doing. The other big issues that have been floating around is just the accumulation of resources in a few charities. The charity sector is increasingly looking like our society, with a few billionaires and then some wealthy people and then a little bit of a middle class and then a lot of poor groups, right? And it's unfortunate, but right now public and private foundations are holding on to about $130 billion worth of assets. So 130 billion, that could be tremendously helpful for operating charities if they had it. But instead, the money's sitting in private foundations, public foundations, donor advised funds, things like that. Huge tax incentives are being given to people to put money into them. And very little is actually coming out in some cases to actually go to, operating charities who are actually helping beneficiaries. So I think that was a big issue that was a problem. And I think there's also a perception beyond just this accumulation of resources, but that wealthy people are using charities for their own ends that are sometimes not aligned with what is necessarily the public benefit or whatever the case may be. And they're getting huge tax benefits, but they're not necessarily having there be huge benefits. So there's some questions being raised about, those types of issues. And just to compound this, the fact that it appears now that CRA has gone from auditing 800 charities down to about 150 a year, This is not helpful. Your chances of being audited if you're just a regular charity, and if it was random, which it's definitely not random, but if it was, your chances are that you'll be audited at some point in the next 400 years. That doesn't inspire tremendous confidence if you're worried that some charities are doing things they shouldn't be, because with such a low number of audits, the likelihood is CRA is going to miss a lot of stuff. And that's why it's important to have transparency, so that the public can be aware of things that are going on, because it's more likely that a person in a charity, a staff person, a volunteer, etc., if, for example, they saw the financial statements of a charity, would be able to say there's a problem here, than some CRA person just looking at it without really knowing what the organization's really doing, right? So that's why I think you put this all together, you end up with a real diminution in the public trust in charities, and it's so important for charities to have this public trust.
Yeah, I'd like to do a bit of a deeper dive into that issue about how you see this drop in trust actually impacting the sector. The lack of regulations and potential oversight and audits might seem like good news to a lot of charities who don't want to be bothered with it. But at the same time, obviously, it can have a massive impact that the resulting issue is that the public loses trust in these organizations. What do you think, how it can be impacting the sector overall?
Right. So public trust is particularly important to charities. I mean, it's important for every institution, government, business, etc., but particularly important to charities, in part because they fundraise, and fundraising it's a voluntary contribution. People don't have to do it, so they could not do it if they didn't want to. As well, fundraising we talk a lot about, but that's 20 to maybe 25 billion a year in revenue. The charity sector has about 300 billion in revenue a year. So what that means is fundraising is actually only a very small part of the money that is going into the charity sector. The biggest amount of money coming into the charity sector comes from government, about 68% of money that comes to charities. So what that means is the public's lack of trust in charities is a problem. But government's lack of trust in charities is a potentially even bigger problem for charities. Okay, so important that charities understand that maintaining trust is quite important. And it's not just about dollars and cents and money and things like that. It's also about people listening to organizations. And we saw during COVID, for example, you would think you have an epidemic, you have a pandemic, who would you listen to? You'd think you'd be listening to like healthcare charities, doctors, things like that. And what we found was that obviously a lot of people weren't listening to that. They were listening to people on Facebook or whatever. And that's also a symptom of, if you had a lot of trust in healthcare institutions, for example, you'd be more likely to trust them with what they say rather than someone on Facebook just putting something up. And, so how much did that hurt, the whole effort? How much did that cause more people to die? How much did that slow down, dealing with COVID? I think it's quite a large impact. So, also just when charities give ideas as to how to make the society a better society, if people don't have a lot of trust in charities, they're less likely to agree with the charity, go with what the charities are suggesting as better things. And it's not just the public, it's also government and that. So I would say the decline in public trust is something that will just make the job of charities so much worse. And your point, I agree with completely. No charity says, "Oh, I wish I was going to be audited by CRA today." But I will tell you that only about maybe 2 to 4% of the audits in the past generally resulted in revocation. That means like 96 to 98% of charities are not they're not being revoked by CRA. And in many cases, they're getting either a clean bill of health or they're getting a few minor comments as to how to improve. And to be frank, many of them after the thing, no one says, "I want to be audited," but they're like, well, it's actually nice to know that someone's looked at all the stuff we're doing and basically things are pretty good. So I think that, it's important in terms of if you think of the system. No individual charity wants to deal with it. But if we had a system where no charities are being audited, for example, which isn't that different than what we have right now, then it allows people to get away with things. And we've got to stop thinking about just what is good for our charity, but we've got to start thinking about what's good for the sector. And unfortunately, some people who get involved in the charity sector do it for nefarious purposes, or maybe they think it's a good in some way, but it's problematic. And if we allow groups like that just to continue on for decades and no oversight or no problem, then it's actually going to make the lives of the whole charity sector much harder. And so that's the difficult balancing act. You don't want to make it too difficult for charities to operate, but on the other hand, you don't want to make it too easy for people who want to misuse charities to be able to get away with it.
Yeah, so from your perspective, ensuring legal compliance and transparency, and I guess you seem to be arguing for greater regulation, or at least oversight in the charitable sector, is really part of the solution in terms of having an outcome that could help regain public trust. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that we need to have more transparency and accountability. I think we have to stop thinking of the charity sector as just being only angels and, nice, well-meaning volunteers getting together to make the world a better place. It's a $300 billion sector involving millions of people, and some of them the most vulnerable people in our country. And we know that there have been, and we discussed it in the beginning, some very high profile situations of problematic behavior. And I think that we just need to realize that, regulation, no one wants to themselves be regulated. Everyone wants freedom to be able to do whatever they want. But some people, are, if you say, well, you can do whatever you want, sometimes they'll do things that you will find really problematic. We need to protect the reputation of the charity sector, just like a franchise protects itself, whether you're a restaurant franchise or something. You put in some basic standards so that you don't end up depreciating the value that you have. The charity sector's ability to fundraise, the ability that it has this positive, unfortunately, not increasingly positive, but decreasingly positive view that the public has of the charity sector, you want to protect that. So you want to put all sorts of things in place. But I would argue that for many good charities, they're going to go far beyond the basic minimal standards that the government of Canada puts out. So, for example, the T3010 and filing that's a minimum standard. You've got to file it as a registered charity, but it gives very little information on the charity. So many groups will, in fact, do a lot more than just filing the T3010. They'll have extensive websites, they'll put up information and do all sorts of other things. So I'm actually encouraging groups to, be transparent, etc. But I'm saying that government needs to follow through, that they're asking for less information today in this more complicated world that we live in than what they asked for 15 years ago is not a good sign. So, for example, I'll just give one example. There are no questions right now on the T3010 on what we used to call political activities, none. So a group could be spending 100% of their $10 million budget on basically arguing that we need to have no immigration to Canada. And they don't have to actually say anything really about that, these public policy dialogue and development activities. That is something that, and by the way, CRA can ask questions if they want, but they've just taken off all the questions. That is a recipe for a disaster where you will have groups, when it comes to political stuff, people don't like secrecy. They don't like things like that. So I see that as an example of something which probably should be fixed. And then charities, as you said, most charities are doing great work and all this, but don't assume that because even you're a great charity that you don't have problems. Be honest about the problems, put them out there. I remember speaking to an investigative journalist, Kevin Donovan, about 10 or 15 years ago, and he said to me, if a charity publicly puts up issues like they put up their financials, they show that in the financials there's a problem, et cetera, he's like, I don't want to write a story about them. It's not really exciting. What's exciting to someone like a Kevin Donovan is to find a charity that doesn't want to be transparent, doesn't want to provide information, and then find out that information through sources and other things. So in fact, one of the risk management things you can do to protect your reputation is to make sure that you're proactively disclosing issues that your charity is dealing with. So that then will help to protect your reputation in the long run.
I'm curious about, well, first of all, I don't understand, why is it the CRA doing so few audits today versus what you said it was something like 800 a year to now it's like just over 100. Why did that happen? How long has it, when did the change occur?
The change has been going on for about 5 or 6 years now, this dramatic decline. I put up a long letter that CRA wrote to me where they tried to justify why they were doing it. They were basically saying, yes, we're doing less audits, but we're doing more sort of educational things with charities and all that. Personally, I think that I'm all for education. I want CRA to do way more education. I think they really should. But I think they need to do a adequate number of audits, and I don't think the 150 or something that they were doing was adequate. But if you want, you can read my blog that I wrote a while ago. I think the National Post also covered this topic because it is quite stark that they've gone such a significant decline, and even 800 is not even a 1% chance of being audited is not great, but it's certainly better than now, what is more like 0.25%. So I think that you have to ask that question to CRA. But I think that it really comes down to risk and perceptions of risk. And I think that after we've seen, for example, some of these scandals, I'm personally thinking that there is quite a bit of risk in the nonprofit and charity sector, that funds, and sometimes we're talking tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, can be misspent when a charity is never being audited, and they're never providing their financial statements. They're never providing really much financial information about the group. The T3010 doesn't tell you too much. Sometimes it's very inaccurate what's there. This is the sort of things that mean that having transparency, and they call it sort of the disinfecting light being there. It doesn't guarantee that there won't be problems, but it makes it less likely there'll be problems. It also makes it more likely that if there's a problem, it'll be discovered sooner. Okay, then this is all about delivering the maximum impact to charitable beneficiaries. Then one has to have some oversight, and I think what we have right now is just not adequate, and it needs to be improved.
And I'm curious about whether you think, I mean, we're talking about the federal government's role in this. Do you think that a home in government and the movement behind having someone in government that represents the sector could be of assistance in at least, I guess, supporting the sector so that it develops greater trust of the public, that it regains its reputation that it's lost in the last decade? What are your thoughts about that?
I used to be a fan of having a home in government. I thought that made a lot of sense. I've watched, however, in some other countries how it's panned out. It hasn't been always a positive thing. I think in the UK, they're just having now the sixth or eighth minister in the last like 6 years holding that portfolio. So constant turnover of people involved. It's extraordinarily expensive sometimes. So if you're asking if we want to bulk up bureaucracy, I could see it. But when we realize these things could cost tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, could that be better spent in another way in the sector to, for example, capacity building, improving the sector, improving the umbrella organizations in the sector, things like that? I think a lot could be done in that area. So I think home and government is a very expensive solution. And just when I've looked at other countries, I'm not sure that it necessarily is the certainly not a panacea. The biggest potential risk with the home and government is it gives a great excuse. Right now, when you're a charity, if you're a healthcare charity, if you're a charity dealing with poverty, etc., you can go to different government agencies, you can lobby them, you can talk to them, you can do whatever. And it makes sense. I mean, if you're a healthcare charity, maybe you should talk to Health Canada about something because it's complicated and that sort of thing. But what I'm worried about is it'll be used as an excuse by government to basically insulate all the different departments and say, no, you have a problem, go to the home and government. That's where you should go. And then you're going to actually have charities having less access to government than they have right now, because many government agencies are very happy to talk to charities about different issues that affect them. And I'm worried that, and remember, you can't always assume you're going to have the same government. You have to always assume different possibilities, different governments, left, right, middle, whatever, coalitions, etc. And where is this going to go? So I think there's a definite risk to the charity sector that a home in government could be used as a way for the government to basically sideline the charity sector and make it look like they're doing wonderful things for the charity sector without actually doing it. So I'm a little bit skeptical at the moment. And of course, I would be very happy if they created this and it was successful. But looking at other countries, I'm seeing more concerns than I'm seeing success. And, on certain topics, certain things, the UK and Australia until very recently were doing far worse than Canada, and they had a home in government. So that's why I'm saying that I'm sort of questioning whether it's the right approach. Okay.
I'm curious about where you see gaps in the existing leadership or advocacy groups on behalf of the national nonprofit sector. I'm curious whether you see any gaps, what might be necessary to create more effective advocacy with the federal government, as well as with promoting the importance of the sector to the general public. I'm curious what your thoughts are in terms of that kind of advocacy role, both towards the federal government, but also reflecting the sector to the public.
Right. At the federal level, I would say that we don't have good advocacy going on a number of different levels. I would say that our umbrella organizations tend to be quite weak and sometimes captured by small interest groups and things like that. I mean, I think the discussion around the disbursement quota was an example. If you ask an average charity, there's $130 billion sitting in private foundations. So do you want that to be dribbled out in, 3.5%? Or do you think it should be 5? Or do you think it should be 7? When the national umbrella organization doesn't take a position in favor of that change until after the consultation is over and beyond the time that anyone could put in any consultation material, I just say I think that then it indicates that the sector's umbrella organizations sometimes are, and by the way, not all did this, but some did. They're completely out of touch with what the needs of the sector are. And that's unfortunate. So I would say it's not so much gaps as probably we need to do a rethinking, have completely different organizations involved. And I've seen examples in some other countries where small advocacy groups, 2, 3 people, can achieve huge amounts, where they have a consistency of purpose, where they're not just jumping around at which funder is going to fund us this week or this year. So therefore, we're going to prioritize whatever that funder wants. And, I'll tell you a little secret that I think but the large foundations that have a lot of assets, they have more money to grant to spend on what they want. They can hire professional fundraisers and professional lobbyists. They can do all sorts of things. And so I never feel like their voice is not going to be heard. And what I saw, for example, in the disbursement quota debate, it felt like certain very narrow interests, their perspectives were given a lot more voice. And so I think that there doesn't have to be any changes. We can keep on going on the path we're at, with the decline in the public trust just increasing, with increasing challenges, or we could say maybe we need to make a change. Maybe we need to do something differently. This is not about specific people necessarily. You've mentioned a couple of times the issue of diversity. I think that's a problem, but that's not the only issue. When you have the same people running an organization for 20 years, then you're going to probably not have too much change within that structure. I think that we've sort of slowly gotten worse and worse in terms of many of the issues. But having better organizations at the national level and also provincial, although in some provinces there are better groups, I think will be helpful. So I think it's very doable. But right now, I think the umbrella organizations seem at times to be very comfortable with certain solutions that are very comfortable for large foundations and certain groups that are quite powerful. And they aren't sometimes as comfortable making suggestions for changes that would be more beneficial to, for example, small charities and things like that. That's my take. And, I don't know if we'll have time to talk about some of the changes that happened last year as a result of the budget, but I would argue that, with the new rules that have come in, we're worse off today than probably where we were a year ago when it comes to the issue of dealing with non-qualified donees. And that's worrisome to me. This is not a CRA issue. This is the actual Income Tax Act has been changed in a number of different ways, and it can have all sorts of different impacts. So, if we're worried about getting money to small groups, to groups that deal with, diverse communities, traditionally underfunded groups and things like that, the approach that the charity sector I think took was not a great approach, and now we're bearing the fruit of that. So I think that, unfortunately, I mean, I wish I could say, we've got great umbrella organizations. They're all doing a wonderful job. this all the problems that we have in the charity sector have nothing to do with it. But I think there's a bit of a retooling needed and changes needed in terms of the umbrella organizations.
I've spoken to some people for this podcast about different kinds of solutions, and one of the solutions that was discussed or suggested was a creation of a sort of almost a committee from different regions that would be almost more of a grassroots sort of approach, so that it wasn't one organization that may have conflicts of interest or may have different sort of alliances for specific parts of the sector, but actually a group or a committee of organizations that can act together. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, there already are. There are groups. I mean, I don't want to single out so much groups, but I mean, I'll single out the ONN, the Ontario Nonprofit Network, which is hundreds and hundreds of organizations, and is pushing lots of ideas that are very beneficial to small and medium-sized charities and things like that, doing a great job of advocating for things. I don't always agree with everything they do, but I mean, 90% of the time I say, wow, that's great stuff. So I think that there are groups like that. On the other hand, we have this, advisory committee that the Minister of National Revenue has set up, which has a whole bunch of people on it. And I mean, I just am at a loss sometimes as to some of the recommendations they're making and things like that, including, for example, that they didn't really recommend an increase in the disbursement quota. So I mean, I don't know how out of touch you can be for what the needs of the charity sector are when you've got this $130 billion sitting there, and in a small number of organizations, and we have all these charities. I mean, Mary, you did notice the pandemic we had, the trouble the charity sectors had. And, unfortunately, although some of my clients and others gave huge amounts more during the pandemic, and that's great, many didn't. Many gave less. Net, the foundations, I'll be very interested to see some of the stats, but they didn't give that much more. And that's very unfortunate. This was like what we call the rainy day, right? Very bad situation. And I didn't feel that many of the foundations sort of rose to the occasion. And that's unfortunate. So I think that there are already groups doing great work, and then there's groups who are doing not so great work. And I think we need to either stop supporting the groups that aren't doing good work, or they need to retool, change, and think about things differently. I don't know what else to say, because we are a diverse sector, 86,000 charities. CRA divides it up into the 252 different categories. But, there are a lot of things that I think would be beneficial for the whole sector if we could get them dealt with. Like improved HR practices, for example. I mean, I'm not sure how many people, I guess some charities are not interested in improved HR practices, but most would say that would be a good thing, right? So I think that there's a lot of stuff that can be done. I don't think there's any new silver bullet. I've heard proposals, all sorts of different proposals coming from different people about changes and tweaks. I think we already have organizations and other entities, but some of them just need a thorough rethinking how they're operating, what they're doing, and things like that would be my take, at least. Okay.
I wanted to really sort of address the issue of philanthropy as a whole. Can you sort of update us on some of the latest legislation and trends that are happening, and what should people know about this? The people in the sector should know about the changes that are occurring in the philanthropic sector.
Well, I mean, there are some changes. Some of the biggest changes that are taking place right now. One of them is bringing in these qualifying disbursement rules, which basically are another path. You have direction and control where a charity can move money to a non-qualified donee, and that, in my mind, was working for billions and billions of dollars every year. But now there's another path. The bigger change net, I think, is not the new qualifying disbursement rules, but the anti-avoidance rules that were brought in last June, which basically say that if you give money, say, to a charity, but it's going to implicitly or explicitly be understood that those funds are actually supposed to go to a non-qualified donee, that will no longer be, that won't be considered a gift. So the person who gave $10 million and got a $10 million receipt, that receipt's going to be worthless. But also the charity that is taking the money and then giving the money over to a non-qualified donee, even if they had direction and control, even if they had the qualifying disbursement rules taken care of, that charity is going to get revoked. This is a big change that is going to affect, like many foundations, many grant-making organizations, how they operate, what they do, the agreements they have with organizations, the restrictions they put on it, and things like that. And, so for example, an organization could give millions to another group. I think it's more complicated right now because those millions may not count as a proper gift or qualifying disbursement if you have these sort of restrictions put on them, which are sometimes there. So it's going to change how foundations, grant-making groups are dealing with things. It's going to mean that they're going to have to, in many cases, retool, rethink their policies that they have on different things. They're also going to have to trust the groups that they're giving money to. So sometimes groups would think, well, if I'm giving money to a group and I do it restricted, that it's more likely that the money will be appropriately spent. And often that's not true. In fact, the best way to make sure your money is appropriately spent is to do good due diligence with a group, make sure it's a trustworthy group. And then in many cases, and there's this concept of trust-based philanthropy. Won't work in every case, but it can be useful in many cases. Use those sort of theories of trust-based philanthropy. But so this is going to be something that is going to, I think, probably more than any other change in the last 5 years, impact how charities move money around, what they say in their agreements and things like that. And I'm seeing many foundations, even very large foundations, giving out tens or hundreds of millions, oblivious, not aware of these changes. So I think that that's going to be probably one of the biggest changes that's going to happen, is people are going to wake up. Unfortunately, what's going to happen is in about 6 months or a year, some of the directors of some of the foundations are going to be furious because they're going to realize that they've been operating and doing things that are very risky without realizing it because they weren't aware of it. The staff that were working for them weren't aware of it. And I think this is going to be a big challenge for them. As you know, there were also some disbursement quota changes, but very minor in a way. It went from 3.5 to 5 when it's over $1 million in assets that an entity has. For the amount over $1 million, you now have to disburse 5%. So for some smaller foundations, this will have zero impact, but for some larger foundations, it will have especially larger foundations that were spending less than 3.5%. And they've got a deficit and they have to make it up and things like that. Those ones will have some really significant challenges. They're going to have to hire more staff. They're going to have to come up with systems that are better to move money quicker and things like that. And then another thing that I think is going to, is sort of happening right now is a lot of groups haven't changed their objects in 10 or 20 or 50 years. But for example, with the new qualifying disbursement rules, if it's not within your objects, it's not a qualifying disbursement. So it's very important that groups take a look at their objects. They're going to change it. But, what I would say is that these are some of the changes. The anti-avoidance stuff, I think, is going to have a huge impact on philanthropy. But the general thing is we're heading in the same direction, which is that many people are having trouble paying their bills, whether it's because of inflation and other things. And charities are going to be mourning the fact that many people, middle class or whatever people, are going to be giving less or not giving to charity. But honestly, can you blame them with all the pressure that they're facing, with the need to pay for out-of-pocket medical expenses increasingly because government is slashing money in some cases that they're giving for healthcare, or they're making stuff more private and all this. So honestly, what we're seeing is actually more money coming into the charity sector, but it's coming from fewer people. In many cases, it's like large, wealthy people, foundations and things. So it's not that less money is going to come in through philanthropy. It's just that it's a smaller group of people, some large donations. If one person gives $100 million, that means 1 million people cannot give $100, and you're in theory in the same place, but it isn't the same place, because what it's meant is also that you have some groups getting huge amounts of money, like you would not believe the amounts of money, like sometimes 10 times more than what they got before. And then you have other groups getting less money, much less money. And so, the average isn't always helpful to understand if there's a big change happening, right? And honestly, a lot of the money is not always going to, groups that really need the money. When a group has 20 years worth of operating money to go with, Do you want to give money so that your money will be used in 25 years, something like that? Is that a good use of your money? Maybe if you want to, you can do that. But I think for most people, they would say, no, that probably isn't something we should give money to. So I think that there's changes happening, and it's meaning that we have more very wealthy charities, very well-off charities, and then you have a lot of charities that are running on fumes, basically, and that's unfortunate. And that's something that it's not a fair way that the charity sector is running. And but I would say it's not that different in our society. We have a big problem of some very wealthy people, versus increasing number of people who are poor. So it's not that different than that. But I think we can say in the charity sector we maintain that we're trying to have more equality, more fairness, and all this. So that's why I think it's a bit more of a challenge for the charity sector when this is happening. It's not a good thing. So I'm hoping that donors will be more aware, will think before they give a little bit more, will think in terms of not just what am I most interested in, but what are the greatest needs in society? How can you help the most vulnerable people in society, and give more money to some of those groups that really, really need the money, as opposed to maybe groups that will, have multi-years of reserves and things and don't need the money. So I think people need to be more sophisticated in a sense. I'm not sure that will happen. They need to think about it. And also people who give money have to, especially wealthy people, need to think carefully about restrictions and how they're distributing it and who they're giving it to and the fairness of it and all that. So I think that's something that, some are doing it. It's not that no one's doing it. It's just that in general, we're seeing less donors and a small number of very major donors that are giving a lot, but also that sometimes they're giving it in ways that are highly restrictive and could create problems for the organizations that are getting it. So it's a complicated story, I guess.
I just wanted to touch on again a conversation that we had before about the chronic lack of funding that Black, Indigenous, and feminist charities and causes, that it's been a really chronic lack of funding for those groups. What needs to change in the philanthropic community to ensure that the funding is more equitable? Is there a way to make it more equitable? Do you think these recent changes that we've talked about, of being able to give to non-qualified donees will end up opening up more funding to these groups and causes?
Yeah, I've worked for maybe 20 years on the issue of funding non-qualified donees. I think it can be amazing to fund non-qualified donees. First of all, most of the international work is done that way. And I'm all for doing that, but we've had rules that have allowed that for a very long time, decades, okay? So I think some people are like waking up as if now we can fund non-qualified donees, but we couldn't a year ago, 5 years ago. I would say now with the changes that have happened, it's more difficult to fund them, not easier. So that's a concern to me because I'm all for funding them, but I also want to have an appropriate balance of, I don't want tens of billions of dollars just going abroad to the Cayman Islands or whatever, and not necessarily being spent at all on charitable activities, but just moving there for charitable purposes, and then maybe moving to another organization for charitable purposes. And then CRA has absolutely no ability, then no oversight, because the one charity will say, we gave away your money for charitable purposes. And so those are not the rules. I'm only saying that was what my worry was, that would be where we were heading to, because there are proposals that groups make that sometimes can have unintended consequences, and so I'm for much more money going abroad or going to non-qualified donees, but also I would prefer that it doesn't just go to big non-qualified donees, that have huge amounts of resources, but also to small groups. So to be frank, like for example, on the international front, I think it's really global affairs would be the way probably to have the biggest impact. When they give money to groups in Canada, they should be thinking how some of that money can be allocated, that it will go to, say, groups that are under 100,000 in revenue that are in the global south. That would be an example. So if global affairs put aside $500 million for that, if you would see a dramatic increase in the amount of money going to those groups. Because if you say to those Canadian charities getting it, you're only going to get it if the money can go to groups that meet certain parameters, then you will see more of that probably happening. But so I think that it's a complicated, I guess, thing. We know that, for example, Black groups, there was that unfunded report, which was excellent, which talked about how almost no money was going to them. I've been writing for a couple of years with a few other people a report on how almost no money is going to Indigenous groups. So, it's 50 to 70 million going to Indigenous groups from all the charities in Canada. And that is a tiny amount of money. Um, it's about 150th of the amount of money that they should be getting if you just looked at population size and things like that. So it's extraordinarily embarrassing, I would say. Why? I think other people might be able to more competently explain, but I think definitely some of the funders, there's a diversity problem, there's a lack of knowledge problem. I mean, I run into funders that will say things like, oh, we're not allowed to fund non-qualified donees. And I say, well, why is that? Oh, it's illegal, and they just don't know. I have for private foundations, sort of my top 16 myths or, things that people think in private foundations that are often not true. It's amazing how little some of the people who are involved with governance on some charities are aware of their compliance obligations. And it's not to say that this is not necessarily deliberate. It's just that they might have joined the board. They don't know what they are. They remember what it was 10 years ago, but it's changed, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But, it's just unfortunate because always Black groups, Indigenous groups could have been funded if groups wanted to fund them. If you don't want to fund them, then it's probably not going to happen. Now the rules maybe are even harder. I'm not sure yet whether it's slightly better, slightly worse, whatever. But I think that we saw recently the federal government announced that it's going to set up a $200 million fund for, basically groups that are, it'll be given to a group that is dealing with funding, groups that are Black serving and Black leadership and things like that. So that'll be nice to see, but it's a tiny amount if you compare it to the $130 billion that's sitting in the foundation sector. So I think many groups need to start asking questions about who are they giving money to. There have been some major foundations recently set up that are focused on giving to diverse communities, which is wonderful. But you can't just have a few new foundations doing this. We need all of the foundations to look carefully at the stuff and to think about it. And I agree with you completely. The funding was very bad that was done in the past. But I'm not sure, to be frank, how much change there's really going to be unless there's a change in leadership in the foundations. I mean, I hope that this is just an educational thing and people can learn that, oh, yeah, you can fund Indigenous groups. By the way, there's like probably about 1,000 Indigenous qualified donees that you can make gifts to. And, so you don't even need to do the funding of non-qualified donees. So if groups want to do the easier path, fund the qualified donees. But if you want to take more of a challenge, maybe you think a non-qualified donee has better skills and other things, then many groups can fund them. And if, by the way, your objects, this gets back to the objects again, if your objects are too narrow, like you only can make gifts to qualified donees, then go back to CRA, and in 2 or 3 months, you can change your objects to having education or, Indigenous reciprocity or whatever objects you want to have. So it requires you have to make a corporate change and do a little bit of work. But, for the world is changing so quickly, I'm hoping to see more improvements. We did see after the terrible sort of situation in the US that there was more, for example, emphasis on funding Black groups. And I think some Black groups really benefited. We'll see if that continues. With Indigenous, we've also started to see some improvements. We'll wait and see. But certainly looking at 2018, 2019, 2020, the numbers were not great for Indigenous. So we'll see how that plays out. I don't think that this change in the legislation is really the key thing. It requires a change in people's perception. If you perceive that it's not important to fund Indigenous or Black groups or groups that are dealing with human rights or whatever, then you will not fund those groups. On the other hand, if you realize, wait a second, there are groups like this, we can fund them. They do important work in our communities, and then hopefully there will be more groups doing it. And I think for grant-making foundations, for example, they really need to look at how do they make their decisions. if you have a small, non-diverse group of people making the decisions, these can be brilliant people. It doesn't mean, however, they're making great decisions. So having participatory grant making, where you, for example, if you're interested in funding, say Indigenous groups, then maybe have a committee that has Indigenous people on it that have a lot of local knowledge, and say to them, we would like, to get some ideas from you on how we should be funding the stuff, and maybe also take some chances. You're allowed to, when you're a charity, make gifts to, say qualified donees or within your objects, whatever it is. Try to look at what they call trust-based philanthropy. You can't always do trust-based philanthropy. If you have limited, restricted money that's restricted for a very particular purpose, you can't just give it to another group without restriction. But most of the money sitting there, that 130 billion, is not restricted. And a lot of it be used for trust-based philanthropy, where basically you're giving money to a group that you've done your due diligence on, they're a good group. So you're not requiring them to fill in big application forms and things like that. You're giving them the money unrestricted. And you're also making multi-year commitments to the group and things like that. This is, although it's now called trust-based philanthropy, this has been around, and some groups have been doing this for decades. It's not a new thing at all. But I think more groups, if they could do some of it or more of it, it would be helpful, because a lot of groups are finding that they're getting a lot of money that's highly restricted, and sometimes with the world changing so quickly. I mean, who could have predicted, that Ukraine is going to be invaded by Russia, or that we're going to have a pandemic and all this stuff. So we need to have more agile funds, and often groups are thinking that they're doing themselves a favor, that they're doing their fiduciary duty by restricting money. In many cases, they're not. It's actually increasing their risk, and it's making the money less worthwhile, and it's not good. But how do you convince, large foundations or others that they need to change, right? And that's a process. So it's either going to happen with there being changes naturally and new people coming into those organizations, or maybe a new staff, or maybe it's education. But it's a hard thing to change a whole group of people who are maybe been doing something the same way for 20 years, and they think that this is the best way to do it. So we'll wait and see what happens there. But I think that I'm hoping that there will be far better funding for traditionally underfunded groups. Okay.
And I guess on the issue of public trust that we were addressing at the top of this conversation, and I guess the health of the sector at large, because they go hand in hand, the trust and the health of the sector. Any last thoughts you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think we need to realize that deregulation and less regulation isn't always a good thing. If you said to the automakers, we're not going to have any regulation on cars, what you're going to get. You're probably in a few years going to get less safe cars. You're going to get less environmentally friendly cars and things like that. Like it's not that hard to work that out. If you have deregulation of the charity sector, and we've had some of it in Canada, you're going to get some people acting in ways that are really problematic, but they might even be legal. And that's not good. So I think that the amount of subsidies is huge. For many wealthy people giving to charity, they're getting back 70 or 80% in terms of tax benefit. So huge tax subsidy. And I think America's taken away the tax subsidy for like 90% of their people, because they don't basically get any tax subsidy when they donate to charity. I'm worried that could happen here in Canada. I think the way to prevent that is to make sure that we have appropriate regulation. That means sometimes it's more regulation of certain things. And sometimes if something's anachronistic or not needed, then we can maybe dispense with that. So the Ontario government has dispensed with some requirements, for example, when you're changing your objects, to get approval from the provincial government, when you're an Ontario charity. That has saved huge amounts of time from groups that are like charities that didn't have to get both the public guardian and trustee and the CRA's approval. And I have no problem with that. Okay. So yes, I can see all sorts of ways we can make things less bureaucratic. But I also think that if we don't have some baseline rules for what a charity is, and that they're enforced, we're going to have this continuation of the lack of public trust and all the negatives that go along with that. So I'm hoping that there will be a more balanced approach, not just deregulation is good, but in fact, having an appropriately regulated sector.
Well, Mark, as always, it's fascinating speaking with you about the nonprofit sector. Your expertise and insight and observations on so many issues are really valuable for me to hear, but also our audience of nonprofit professionals. Thank you so much for joining us on Charity Village Connects.
Thank you, Mary, for organizing this. I really appreciate it, and all the work that Charity Village does to build up the sector.